Okay, I do actually think that this video is going to be shorter than the last because I usually have you watch a movie instead of playing clips throughout. So we'll see. It may end up being 40 minutes after all, but I expected these to be closer to 30, 35. So we'll try. If you bring up your notes on Italian Neorealism, this is where we really start getting into what tend to be the this is the perfect example of the formal elements of a working class audience, because to give you the context for what is happening after World War II, it is absolutely devastating to much of Europe, to the economy, right? So we get to this point in which, if you watch the movie, and I will, to me, I usually require it in class. I will consider it recommended viewing. I will consider the first 10 minutes required viewing. So if you'll do that for me, at least watch the first 10 minutes, get an idea for what is going on in Bicycle Thieves, which is the one, it's posted on your syllabus. That's the one that we're thinking of. So you'll see the context upon first watching this movie, in which there are masses of crowds. They're waiting for job postings. Finally, the guy gets a job, and this is one of the saddest class periods I have. I'm about to, spoiler alert it for you. So you see everyone's waiting for a job. Finally, he gets called, the main character gets called for a job. It requires that he has a bicycle. So he shows up first day of work, he's got his bicycle, he gets there, he's painting on advertisements of all these other people who are out of work, which means that everyone's in the pawn shops trying to pawn off things to make money just to get by for the next day. So his bicycle gets stolen. We don't see any of the context for the bicycle thief, and what ends up happening is that he runs off with the bicycle, and no one helps him. He's saying, "Thief, thief," and no one around him helps him as he's trying to get it, and he gets away. So he spends the rest of the movie trying to hunt down this bicycle because he needs it for work. It's so desperate. They end up pawning their sheets, and I will talk about a specific moment in that movie when we get to it. And at the very end, after seeing all this context where he has to take his son with him to find bicycle parts, he has to take his son with him, and he says, well, we're out all this money, and so might as well get, he gets this smallest pizza, which is a treat for him, and they see the people next to them who are, they can order whatever they want, they can get desserts and drinks and whatnot. And at the very end, we have this moment in which a bicycle is just sitting out. It seems unattended, and he tells his son to get on the next train home, and you can see him looking at it he really doesn't want to make this decision, right? It's the last thing that he wants to do after what happened to him, and he takes the bicycle, and immediately the same thing happens. Someone else says, "Thief, thief." But what happens in this instance is that his son waited and was trying to see what was going on with his dad, and he has to watch as his dad gets accosted by crowds who all try to stop him from taking the bike. And it is one of the, you can see me tearing up right now, one of the saddest narratives. But the whole point of this movie is that you go through it, the hour long, however long, and you stand by them, and so you get the context of someone who would be in that situation. And so now you start imagining, whereas you hate, right, the villain in the beginning, you start saying, what would drive someone, especially in this economic downpour, to have to steal a bike, right? To say that I need this more than someone else right now because I have to think of my family and make money. So this is, right, the whole point is that you don't, it gives you a much clearer context of heroes and villains that you don't get in propaganda type films. And so you can understand that after this war, many of the art cinema movements that happen, they are so close to the war, they remember the war intimately and what happened with all of this propaganda type filmmaking, that everyone is on board with showing the working class in a much more positive light, with showing them in a realistic documentary type light. So let's go through some of those formal elements real quick. Specifically the formal, and remember this is formal. There are some, I think, thematic narrative elements maybe included in here. So on location shooting is a huge one. This doesn't mean that on location shooting, sometimes they construct props and put them to the location. But genuinely, these are like homes that people genuinely live in within these situations. These are real buildings, real places of exchange. They use the real streets, right? They're not setting up sets. Use of non-professional actors as a disclaimer. Many of these used professional actors for like the starring roles, and then they would use non-professional actors as both supporting roles and people on the street. Sometimes they would use non-professional actors as the starring roles, but it wasn't like people never used stars. That wasn't the case, to say that it never happened. And in fact, many of them used professional for the stars. Natural lighting, right? So this is the lighting that's naturally coming in through the windows. It's not setting up three-point lighting. It's not setting up the DeMille effects lighting that we talked about last class. It's not doing any of these noir spectacle type things. It's using whatever you have during the given situation. Free-moving documentary style filmmaking. This is handheld. We're not like dollying to make it seem smoother. We're following them around from wherever we can access, right? So that it looks like the realism is what we're getting at here. And then also non-interventionist approach to directing. What they mean by that is the director isn't going to cut in and say, you need to do this, right? It's letting it unfold. It's letting go of control, the control that we've seen in all the aesthetics for up until this point. It's saying, instead of saying, we need you to move this way or do this shot so that we can get it, it's telling them the general situation, letting it play out, right? And as we've always said, it doesn't mean that it's completely, because this is a different ideology, right? It's not that it's free of ideology. None of that is possible in representation. You are still always making choices what to include on frame, what angle, which thereby shows other things in the background or in the foreground, right? You're always making aesthetic distinctions. You can't get away from that. But it's saying that I am not going to intervene in a way in which it's my movie. I have to control what happens and how it happens. To get to that free-flowing kind of style, the way people naturally move or say things. Avoidance of complex editing and other post-production film processes. In other words, the long take is the way that people tend to phrase this. The long take being, a very short take would be editing small chunks together in these quick cuts. It's letting it draw on. And the example that I will give you from the middle of the movie that I just referred to is the point in which the woman goes into to exchange her sheets because she needs money to buy, I'm not sure what it is, but she's going off to pawn her sheets so that they can get something else before he starts his job, or during, I can't remember. So she's taking her sheets, and instead of her, who would be the main character or the story-driven person of the narrative, usually we would hand the sheets in any Hollywood movie, and then we would either cut to a new scene that has to do with the narrative we're interested in, right? Or we would continue following her wherever she goes from there, is what we would do. Instead, what happens is we cut from her, and then we move to the guy who takes the sheets, and we have this long take as he walks behind, away from all the people who are trying to pawn off their items, the like crowds, and we see him walk down a hallway, walk all the way up a set of stairs, and put the sheets in this massive pile of other people that have pawned sheets as he walks past like these rows and rows of bicycles. It's trying to show both, it's trying to give, instead of the hero, right, like sticking to this point in which we always follow the hero and anyone who surrounds them closer, we also give them a little more context, and you flesh them out how close you are to the hero. And the farther away you get from the hero, the more you just become someone who is necessary depending on what you need them for the narrative. They're not real people, right? They don't have any context. However, what this does is it shows, first of all, how many people are doing the same exact things that they're doing, right? It's relating the heroes or the people that we follow to the rest of the masses, that we could just as easily be following any one of them. There's nothing special about this particular family, is what it's saying. And then also we follow him as he moves all the way up this long take to something that says, instead of saying we only value the narrative, we say we also value this person who we will never again see, right? That we should give time. It's an ethical decision, right? To the supporting and then the not even supporting characters, the random people, and see what their lives look like. Andre Bazin is kind of the characteristic director that we talk about. He's also a film theorist during this movement, because we're starting to get to the point where film theory is even developing as a discipline. It's developing both out of filmmakers themselves, I think I've said this before, and also out of different people from different departments and university schools who especially like fiction and whatnot. Anything that is related, they're starting to come together. Historical scholars, right? Technology schools are coming together and starting to theorize about cinema. So Andre Bazin is a film theorist. He's also a director. One of neorealism's biggest supporters, film theorists, views the style as cinema of fact or reconstituted reportage. And the reason I ask what does reconstituted here mean is because it's very clearly, if I were to ask you why would he call it reportage, you would say it's not reportage. It's not reporting on anything, on any real events that happen. But he's saying, I'm reconstituting, it's very much like the, not the scenics, the topicals, which were, right, this reconstructing historical events that did happen. That's what he means by reconstituted. He's saying, no, these are not, this is not a news, this is not a reportage, but it's reconstituting events that very much could have happened and would have happened much like this, given it, as opposed to if I reconstituted it in a narrative film style, it would not have happened very much like that, right? Okay, it's keeping to realism. So Mira Liam characterizes it as an aesthetics of rejection. After an era of fascism rejects the visual styles, the mythologies, the politics, and production methods that work well with fascist ideologies. In other words, is rejecting much of all of the tendencies in classical Hollywood cinema style, if that tells you anything. Not necessarily the opposite, but one such choices that you could choose to make in saying we are not doing this style. If you're looking into other styles that exist that are not Hollywood, right? You could think of like third cinema is something that you could go and research. There are multiple, or especially since we've been tracking critical race theory throughout this class, you could think of like the LA Rebellion at UCLA and what they were doing. They were looking at third cinema. They were looking at Italian neorealism. They were saying we need to develop a style that is Black aesthetics for what's going on right now in the civil rights movement, but it needs to be our own. It needs to be something that represents us. But how are we going to figure this out through other movements that have said we're not accepting this visual style? So it's not a binary, not to give you that idea. It's a network, right, of different nodes. And there are things that are closer to Hollywood as well, but aren't Hollywood. So neorealist filmmakers in 1940s and 50s were of the most educated in film history at this point. René Clair and Renoir, who is a painter, hopefully you know that, an incredible influence on this style. René Clair we talked about last class, hopefully you're watching these in order. For example, Renoir's Tony provided the precursor for a real neorealist narrative and its focus on working class subjects. You can see a lot of these things happening in tandem, which is how things tend to do when your entire continent is going through much of the similar things. They're all going through fascism, so of course the ideology of how do we combat this is going to pop up. That's a logical next step, right? How do we prevent this from happening in the future? And so what you will expect is that the moment right after the war, we're going to have a bunch of these movements that are happening that are saying, we want to be nothing like Hollywood propaganda, Soviet montage type of aesthetics. We want nothing to do with that. Almost all of these different movements are doing that. What do you think happens? This is also, I'm going to answer it because I know none of you can answer it. What do you think happens as we move towards the 60s and the 70s then? They get less and less distance from the effects of World War II. They get farther. All of these artists are not as intimately related to World War II. They still have the effects, right? Don't get me wrong. They're still contemplating these kinds of things. But as this middle class, this post-war middle class starts developing, people, when they say, well, we want to... now they start asking questions. Of course, this is how things logically unfold, right? A middle class is developing. They're forgetting. They're starting to forget the way that we got here. The artists are saying, how do we also reach these people? Because it's not going to be through these aesthetics anymore. And how do we reveal right? How do we reveal these aesthetics of a middle class that we've never had to deal with before for what they are, for this forgetting? They have to develop a whole new aesthetic, ideological positioning in response to that. So of course it's going to look very different as we start getting farther and farther away from fascism being as closely linked to what we're dealing with. So and for here we're about to define experimental, refinement, Baroque. I forgot classical. I'll say it in order once we get there. And so what this part in the notes is kind of getting at, as Italian Neorealism dates 1943 to 1952. This is to give you some semblance of this is directly post-war, right? French New Wave, which we're going to talk about right after Exam 2, dates 1950s to 60s. We will come back to this, so I'm not going to get into the reason I get into this paragraph is to show you the breaking with these stark anti-fascist aesthetics post-war, is to show you some of that breaking away, right? And so if you will go ahead and, saying that Neorealism acts as a precedent to the New Waves, if you'll go ahead and move down to the experimental phase, the classical phase, the refinement phase, and the Baroque phase, you will absolutely be tested on all four of these. There will be at least 2 questions on the exam about these. And they say in these notes, we will define them in class. That's here in this video. What I would recommend you do is you pull up the notes and you go ahead and type in the definitions so that you have them readily available by the time you're taking the exam. And this is also the reason I bring up the French New Wave, its dates and whatnot as well, because we're going to talk about how the Baroque phase of one period or one movement will oftentimes be the experimental phase of the new one that's just bubbling up. And that's why I include Jean-Luc Godard, right? So experimental phase, let's define that. This is the point in which we talked about, for instance, genre, when I was showing you in the very beginning of cinema how we say, no, we can, yes, now we can say that there is such a thing as a Western, and this looks like a Western to us. But there was no solidified movement that told them in that time period that there is such a thing as a Western, right? So all you see is this is this kind of like Western horse movie, like that's it. It's not a Western, it doesn't have these kinds of conventions. But it is this experimental beginning. Even though there are no rules set in place, it's starting to accumulate what rules they think would logically go with a story that is following these patterns, right? So the way that we're going to define experimental phase for the purposes of this class is there are no clearly defined rules. There are no formal or narrative elements to the style yet. This is only comprehensible retrospectively, right? Once you can see that this was experimenting with something that would become a classical phase of something else. So it's the beginning formation of stylistic and narrative collections, associations, and themes. It's the point in which the elements of a style begin to accumulate and form a collective movement or tendency. The classical phase. This is once a style's formal, narrative, and thematic elements have congealed, right? We can now define traits that tend to take place in the style, regardless of whether certain directors either omit an element that tends to take place or include an element that others don't. The point is that once you are in the classical phase, during that period, you now recognize something as a Western. You know that a Western is a type of movie that you can go to, and you know what you tend to expect. This is now definable within the period. Everything is congealed into something in which you're going to get something that is very similar to the next movie. It's going to change out the characters. It's going to be a different guy. He's going to have a different specific backstory or trouble that he's going through, but they're going to move through much of the same exact climaxes, fall to something else, and they're formally also going to work with the same kinds of mise-en-scène, whatnot. The refinement phase. Even though in the classical phase we have directors who tend towards certain elements and who don't, the refinement phase is specifically the point in which directors who have been in this style and who are just now entering the style have been in this style for years. They still keep with the general guidelines, but they begin adding more elements that don't line up with the canon. They also start deciding to omit other elements that tend to be included in the canon. Why is this? Because with any movement, people are going to start to get bored, right? If you don't change it up. It's also no longer historically relevant if you don't change it up to the contemporary issues of the time. So they begin to play with the order as well, right? So the hero enters society. He is rejected by society. These are some Western like elements that come into play. And then someone close to him dies. He gets revenge or he helps enact lawlessness. They ask him to be the sheriff. then he refuses, something else happening, right? And so these are like some of the classical phase kinds of things. The refinement phase is now saying, you're bored with seeing this thing over and over again. We're going to start playing with the order. We're going to start playing with the form, aesthetic, and narrative content. We're going to move around when they happen. We're going to start omitting more and adding in other like random details that aren't associated with the canon. So it's not necessarily this anything goes. It is, we have now recognized this form for so long that we're just playing with it. We're just doing it to basically refresh it, keep it interesting is what's happening there. Baroque phase is now where the style has not only been clearly established in canon, they're no longer just playing with it. It's now been significantly reworked by later proponents within the movement, right? Which means that we can now, as people who have seen it be a recognized movement, have seen it be played with the small aesthetics, we can now wholly comment on all of the traditions within the narrative. Audiences are now completely savvy and comfortable with what it tends to mean or do or whatnot, that you can put them in any order that you want. And the best example of this to me for using the Western as our through line is Django Unchained, right? It is playing with the connotations of a classical Western, which is typically a racist story. It's a story literally about moving out west, conquering the wilderness, and imposing civilized value on the uncivilized and lawless, what they term Indians, right? They're not from India. Not yet societies out west. They're imposing all of these very cultural values onto the other. So when you place a black person as the main character within this context, there is obviously plenty of room to comment on these classical tropes, because every new situation in which he moves into these classical narrative tropes, he is going to bring up all of the connotations that a black person is going to bring up that the traditional white hero won't, is going to inherently comment on the connotations of tropes at the moment in each new situation. So as he moves through that narrative, regardless, it is constantly, you cannot play with it in a way that is so familiar unless you get to that point in which you can wholly mix things up and just take it away from the tradition, because people are so familiar with it. So that's a good example. And the point here, obviously, is that, and who we're using for this is Antonioni. You'll see him below when we get to him. Antonioni is a great example who is this Baroque phase of Italian Neorealism, and then moves into this new wave aesthetic, right? And I'm sure you've heard of Antonioni before. He's one of those art names that people throw around a lot. Let's finish with Bazin before we move there. Andre Bazin, film theorist, filmmaker, wrote a series of essays concerned with cinema's ontology. Usually here I would define on the board what ontology means. I am just going to say it to you. So ontology is the study of being. I know that sounds... Every time even in my graduate class, I had to go like relook up ontology, and I'm like, what does that even mean? The study of being, like that sounds so vague, and it's not going to make any sense to you until you work with it for so long. It's coming up with what is the essence of cinema, and that means very different things for very different people, right? So for Andre Bazin, for example, he says it's returning to the things themselves. He places cinema above painting as a means for depicting reality and above photography. And the questions I ask in these notes are why. And if we were in class, I would say, why does he place it as better means for depicting reality? If that's how he's defining getting to the things themselves, and this is the tool that we use to best represent the real world, why better than painting? Because it is giving an actual light depiction of the people. Painting can never do that, the representation function. Why better than photography? That's also giving this realism representation. It gives you movement, and movement is inherent to reality. This is why he thinks that cinema is this like ontological truth technological form of our time. However, again, if you were to ask what is the ontology of cinema to any of the Soviet montage practitioners, what would they say in class? This is the part where you would say editing. Why would they argue that? Editing is the only thing that is the essence of cinema to them, because it is the only thing that belongs to cinema alone. It doesn't belong to, right? And so you can see the difference. For Bazin, realism is the essence of cinema. For Soviet montage, editing, specifically the practice, is the essence of cinema. Ontology, hopefully this is becoming clearer, even if it hasn't become completely. Ontology is the practice of getting to What is the essence of the thing that the other things do not possess? That's what ontology is. If you understand it as the study of being, I will be happy with you learning that over the course of this class. Okay, ethical and moral link between the situation in the real world and artistic creation. This is why he cares about depicting reality. He believes that there is an ethical project that has to be done to prevent us from ever getting to a World War II situation again. By linking these, he says one does not achieve a way of circumventing the ideological, but it acts as a way through the impasse of the ideological. It is a pseudo-realism in order to get at true realism and in order to get at bypassing constraints of especially geography, right, to be able to distribute it widely. Finally, he argues for art as progressing towards realism throughout history, with cinema as its most convincing form. This is not to say that he does not think that there will not be more convincing forms developed eventually. He's saying this is the best practice we have to depict realism in our time. So then he talks about cave drawings, mummification, painting, sculpture. He goes through, right, painting is 2D. Sculpture is the attempt to get at the realism of the 3D. He's talking about how all of these are this quest towards realism, and we've talked about in this class, the same thing is happening in digital cinema. Why do we continue to get towards why are we moving right now towards virtual reality? It's even happening in our apps, right? The biggest thing right now is we know that we don't have the technology to make virtual reality a thing yet, but we know we want it. So it's starting to come up in our aesthetics and our apps with Pokemon Go, with things like it's instead overlaying the fictional world on top of the real world, to say, or the Harry Potter app, right? To say, if you move this where in the real world, this is what lines up with it in the fantasy world. It's this desire that comes through in the aesthetics. Okay. Cinema's quest for realism as a part of its ontology, and the ontology of all of these developments in art over the course of art history. I've already said this, so we're going to move past the aesthetic decision portion. We are now jumping to Italian Neorealism's second phase, and this is where the Baroque phase comes into both the refinement, because honestly he's more of a refinement moving into Baroque himself, because these people have careers. Let me get some coffee real quick. I'm speaking fast to try to move on. So Antonioni is the dude who scripted. Usually I would talk about Rossellini, but for the purposes of the online lecture, we're not going to do that. Usually I would actually go into extensive talks about Ossessione specifically, so I know this doesn't make sense to you, but we're going to move through it regardless. He praised the realist style and first shot 2 documentary films before moving into Neorealist realm. He shot these, which is, just think about this fact. He started in documentary, which is supposedly, if you're in aesthetic class, we would know that there are many types of documentary. None of them are pure realism ever. And then he moves into Neorealist. And by the end of this, he gets into this full-blown difference, right? So he shot traditional Neorealist narratives initially, felt the need to expand Neorealist focus on the working class to middle-class narratives. Why? He has been criticized for this move. The result seems to be strengthening the initial goal by turning the camera on the bourgeoisie, who were the ideal in which liberal capitalism was founded. And what I would do in class, of course, is ask you, why would you need to turn it on the middle class? Well, there's a growing middle class. If you are trying to identify with the working people and you're trying to influence the masses, who are the masses now? The majority of them are now turning into a middle class. The people that you need to influence, that we need to that we need to hold on to these working class truths as well. Then you need to expose the bourgeoisie infiltration into the middle class is what is happening right now, right? You need to expose to themselves. You need to, and so a lot of times what you get with these kinds of, and we'll talk about this extensively once we get past exam 2 with the new waves, you start getting these middle class people who have everything, right? But they always have this wandering type of desire. They don't know what they want. They don't know why they want more, but they continually want more. And they're just confused, depressed, whatnot. It's that very ennui type French cinema that you associate when you think of art cinema in general. So this is why he moves to it while he's criticized for it. And obviously, if you are at the tail end of a movement that is about depicting the working class, and then you make a move to say, I'm going to show these middle class people, of course you're going to look like the dude who's like you're like, I think these should be the important people that take focus. When really he's saying, I think these should be the important people that take focus because we need to show them, right, something specifically about it, something sinister that is evolving as we get farther away from World War II and people are getting disconnected from the realities of what happened last time we evolved down this path, right? So that's what's going on. Let me see. We actually just discussed this last part. Of course, these are the kinds of things that would be on your test, though, which is why I include them in the notes. Why would he use the middle class as a focal point going forward? The answer is growing middle class. If you need to speak to the middle class about the dangers of what is happening, about the cultural shift that is happening that got us, while you still, even though it's becoming more distant, but you still remember the effects of fascism, right? This is the goal. You got to flip the script, and you got to still talk to the masses, no matter who they're becoming, right? You have to speak to the population, speak to the people in general. Frame the middle class differently than their bare reality. This is again the infiltration of as he becomes more Baroque, right? Because he's not sticking. Neorealism is all about sticking to the bare reality. He starts inserting all these like formal. He starts inserting style into it, right? He starts framing these people in a specific way, giving them connotations, giving them certain power dynamics and whatnot through the formal elements. So then the question is, if you are a neorealist, why, once you move your focus to the middle class, do you also need to move the way that you frame your aesthetic elements? Because you're making a different rhetorical decision is the answer, right? So you can no longer, what would happen if you showed the middle class in the same aesthetic, the bare reality that you were giving to the working class? Well, what would happen? They would look mundane. All of this accumulation of wealth that is happening, it would look incredibly natural. And what is being naturalized with all the other aesthetics that are going on in history at that moment in time is the idea, if you just show it plainly, then you're not commenting on it. You're not criticizing it anymore. Instead, all they're going to see is, look how nice their lives are if you show it plainly, right? So you also need to adapt the formal style to fit. So this is also, again, when we talked about last class, the difference between form and content, right? So why is it that noir was the same content, even though the formal ideological structure underneath, as these happy like housewife videos is what I'm going to call them. They're not videos yet, I'm sorry, films, TV, whatnot. So how is it that the formal structure can have two different aesthetic content on the surface? This is the opposite of that. This is him keeping the same ideology, and as he knows that he needs to move content in order to keep that ideological structure underneath, he has to change the form. Because in order for him to be able to use the same rhetoric to get the desired result, he can no longer approach these subjects, this content that is wholly different from the content he was approaching before, with the same formal practice. That's not possible if you're going for the same goal, because those people have to be contextually situated within what your goals are, right? And they have a different situation. Okay, and so we talked about all of these things. How do the mundane realities of middle-class people tend to be interpreted if left unattended as realism without an aesthetic framing? Well, they tend to look desirable. They look mundane. It doesn't look like anything sinister is happening there. Instead, it looks like something that is exactly super happy is going on there, right? Our economies are flourishing. While they're saying, this is exactly what happened last time, and you're letting it happen again. Okay, there is an ideological predisposition in the dominant views of the audience in each historical moment that must be accounted for, is the wrapping up of this. And I did it. This one is closer to 35 minutes. So that's because I'm not having you watch all the clips in between. It should end up being more like 40 minutes. It should take you, like I said, watch the first 10 minutes of Bicycle Thieves. And that one, I think, is by Desika. Let me double check before I send you. Bicycle Thieves. Leave the site. Sorry. Yes, it's by Vittorio Desika. So good. Look that up. Hopefully, I'm sure you can find it free on YouTube. I found it free before on YouTube. And I will see you next video, hopefully wearing something different with less greasy hair. Okay, have a good one.